don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I'm joined by Vladimir Kogan, who is a political science professor at Ohio State University and the author of a new book titled No Adult Left Behind: How Politics Hijacks Education Policy and Hurts Kids. In our conversation, Vlad and I dive into the core arguments of his book, exploring the fundamental disconnect between the purpose of schools, which one would think would be educating children, and their governance by adults. We discuss how this often leads to adult interests being prioritized over student academic learning. In particular, we discussed how the demographic makeup of voters in school board elections often skews toward elderly adults without school-aged children, which influences policy priorities. We talked about partisan polarization and how the top-down, elite-driven process that turns seemingly nonpartisan education issues like school reopenings during the pandemic or Common Core standards into highly politicized debates, the shifting partisanship of reading instruction, and the interesting case study on how media influence like the work of Emily Hanford help depoliticize the reading wars and build bipartisan consensus around science-based reading laws, the incoherent legislative decisions and examples of how state legislators can vote inconsistently on issues like critical race theory bans versus science of reading mandates, which are often driven by perceived public opinion, tribalism, and constituent mobilization. The idea that while most individuals in education debates have good intentions, misaligned incentives, and a failure to consider unintended consequences can lead to negative outcomes. We ended the conversation talking about the role of teacher preparation programs and concerns about whether some programs prioritize social justice agendas at the expense of fundamental pedagogical training, contributing to somewhat of an ideological insularity. And I shared my thoughts about that, as well as talking about his provocative suggestion that insulating education from direct democratic control, similar to independent judges or the Federal Reserve, could lead to improved academic outcomes. It's a really thought-provoking book and discussion that challenges us to consider how we can better align our education system with the needs of the students, and I recommend you pick it up, and the link to that will be in the show notes, of course. As always, I recommend that you also visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, to find out more about our professional learning, which is always centered around the idea of inquiry and what we call knowledge-rich inquiry. You can find all kinds of resources, including our blogs in this podcast and our workshops and professional learning options there. And as always, if you have any comments, questions, or want to contact me directly, my email is drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here is my conversation with Vladimir. I am with Vladimir Kogan, and we're going to talk about his new book, No Adult Left Behind: How Politics Hijacks Education Policy and Hurts Kids. As I usually like to do, I want to welcome you to the podcast and give you an opportunity to say hello and introduce yourself and give any details you think might be helpful and interesting for folks that are listening to us.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So I'm a professor of political science here at Ohio State, but this book grows out of a broader project with a number of colleagues, some political scientists, some education policy folks, and really goes all the way back to my experience covering education as a journalist in San Diego, now almost 20 years ago. And so this is kind of an effort to bring together, all the work that we've done over the years, collecting data on education governance, and really making the case that governance is really an important part of the story, and in many ways one of the main barriers to improving public education in the United States.
And yeah, I noticed in the intro or the early part of before it got to the table of contents in your book that you did used to be a journalist. I'm curious how you matriculated from journalism to being a political science professor.
Yeah, well, I was a political science undergraduate, and then I thought about going to graduate school to study public policy, and at the last minute decided not to. And it turns out that a political science degree doesn't actually prepare you for very many careers. But I had been, I had been on my high school newspaper. I was the editor of that. I was on my newspaper in college all throughout. So when I graduated, I needed a job. Journalism seemed like an area where I actually had some real life skills. And so I did that. And my first job actually was at a newspaper called the Santa Barbara News Press, which was going through some really crazy drama. It just ended up filing for bankruptcy recently. And then from there, I ultimately got a job at the Voice of San Diego, which was the first online-only local nonprofit organization, kind of like modeled on ProPublica, doing investigative journalism. And they weren't covering education at the time. And San Diego Unified is one of the largest districts in California. So I did that, and then I decided I wanted to go back to graduate school. Did not think I would do anything education related at all. And so it actually wasn't until after graduate school, when I got to Ohio State and met some colleagues here, that it kind of all came back full circle, and we realized there was actually a lot of politics in education, and so it connected to many of the things I was doing before.
Yeah, unfortunately, that last sentence is unfortunately very true. So I have a political science degree from Michigan State University and graduated and thought, what the heck am I going to do? And ended up in education, and now I do what I'm doing. But I imagine between going from journalism to political science, so one of the things that I noticed about political science writing is that they seem to use way more words than are necessary in lots of cases. And
Yeah.
that has to have been some sort of attention with a journalism career, which usually is something of the opposite.
Yeah, and there's a lot of jargon, yeah, for sure. So, it is definitely a challenge. I mean, in some ways, it, especially a lot of the empirical work we do, it is hard to communicate really, very complex mathematical concepts. So some of it's just, I think, inherent into the methods. But you're absolutely right that a lot of these things are much less accessible than they really need to be. And certainly, I don't know what you thought, but when I wrote the book proposal, I really wanted to write an academic book, but an academic book that was actually accessible to a lay audience. I didn't have literature review. I have a lot of first person. I used a little bit of jargon, but not too much.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting to see kind of the feedback that I've gotten. I think in general, pretty positive on that front.
Yeah.
A lot of my colleagues were like, "Oh, wow, this is like a very different book than the kind of book we usually read."
Yeah, well, Leviathan it is not, but yeah, it's definitely much more accessible than a lot of political science writing. But you cover a lot of ground, so let's get into it. We're certainly not going to cover, I don't think, all the ground here, but I guess one of the maybe best questions is to start with is to ask you, what's your book about? What's the big picture here?
Yeah, the big picture. At the end of the day, schools exist to educate kids. But the way we govern schools, particularly public schools, is through elections. And of course, in the United States, the voting age is 18. And so there's just this fundamental disconnect that's really hardwired right into the governance system, right? We have a system in theory for kids, but really governed by adults. And, if you look to see who votes in particularly low turnout off-cycle school board elections, it's not just adults, but it's actually mostly elderly adults without school-age children. And so we have, this fundamental disconnect where the interests of the students are really arguably very poorly represented and very poorly incentivized through the political process, because the adults who vote don't necessarily care all that much about what happens to the students. And so, maybe thinking about this in the context of current debates, we have a lot of gerrymandering going on, and a lot of controversy over gerrymandering. But I would argue that, in the K-12 education, we have always had gerrymandering. Right? We have set up a governance system that effectively gerrymanders public education to serve the interests of adults, often at the expense of academics and academic considerations and academic learning of children. That's kind of the big picture argument.
Yeah, so you referenced it a little bit there, and I think the first chapter is what are schools for, and I hopefully want to get to the last chapter, which are some recommendations and I think a framework for education reform, which the way I read it kind of circles back to at least one of the things, which is what are schools for. Your chapter there kind of makes the point that it is not necessarily always true that people think about schools being first priority on educating kids. So maybe you can unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. I've have had a lot of arguments on this front. So the first chapter kind of engages some of that, and I think there's two perspectives that I think are I'll lay out that I fundamentally disagree with, but I think are related to this. One is maybe the easier argument, which is schools aren't just there to serve kids. Schools are quote unquote community institutions, and so they're there for the whole community, right? They're there for the property owners. They're there for the employees. They're there for the alumni, et cetera, which I think, again, in the abstract makes sense. I think that's not a difficult argument to make. I think the challenge is what happens in the cases where all those interests are in some ways in conflict. What must give way and what ends up winning out? And I think when we get to those areas, and I think there's actually a lot of areas where there are conflicting incentives. I would argue that again, ultimately, it should be student learning that wins out. And I think, unfortunately, that's not the case. And certainly, when we talk about school closures and the decision to reduce the number of buildings you have in the face of declining enrollment, none of that is about academics, even though sometimes people use kind of that rhetoric. It's really much more about, again, alumni that don't want to see their schools close. It's much more about the adults who want to work in that building. And so I think in those cases where there are, again, conflicts of interest, where there are multiple things that all can't get done at the same time, my position is, we got to do what's best for kids. And I think, again, my argument for that is, I think in principle, that's what we do in most other policy areas, right? When you have government policy and you have to figure out, do I do what's best for voters or for special interest groups or for other vested interests? In general, as a normative matter, I think all of us generally think it should be about the constituents, not all these other groups. And I think in education is the one area where that contention is even controversial, and people actually argue that it shouldn't just be about educating students. But then I think the second question related is, okay, suppose I kind of convinced you that it should be primarily about students. Well, what is it that schools do? What does it mean to provide a good education? And again, I think there's a lot of disagreement, and I make a pretty strong position that we should care about academics as measured by standardized test scores, and especially not necessarily test scores at a point in time, but really year-to-year growth. And I think that's another area that, particularly in the K-12 education profession, I think there's a lot of skepticism, right? I think people dismiss the idea that test scores matter or that they should matter as much as many other things. And I don't necessarily take the view that test scores are all that matter, but I guess in my mind, it's kind of like thinking about vital signs. When you go to the doctor, they measure your blood pressure, they measure your respiration rate, they measure your pulse, and if all those things are fine, it doesn't mean that you're healthy. It doesn't mean that you don't have other chronic conditions that could kill you. But if you don't have a pulse, that's like a huge problem, right? So we got to, at minimum, make sure that when you're at the doctor, the vital signs all look good. And for me, test scores are a vital sign, right? That if students are not making a year of growth from year to year, that's a sign of some sort of institutional failure. It's a sign that something is going wrong. And it's a sign that's probably on other dimensions that we can't necessarily measure in the same way we can measure test scores. There's probably other things going wrong as well. So that's kind of my pitch, at least, for why we should care about what schools do, and particularly how much they grow kids from year to year.
Yeah, and the second chapter gets into what you call skin in the game, and I think it's obviously very true that at least some of the folks that are responsible for the local decision making, I think you make the argument about school boards and the people are voting and making the choices or influencing the choices and heavily influencing the choices, may not necessarily be the ones that have kids in school. And so there's so many competing interests, right? There's you talk about teachers' unions and politics is one way to characterize politics is the art of compromise or the need to compromise and figuring out best ways forward. But we seem unusually unable to do that in almost all of the cases in school, K-12 education, public education, in so many ways. It just feels like Sisyphus always trying to push this rock up the hill. And so it maybe unpack a little bit what you mean, like you're talking about some of the examples of San Francisco and some other places where the politics in the decision making just technically, the technical term probably is bonkers. Like some of the things that you would talk about that I've heard about. They're focusing on renaming schools when their reading and test scores are abysmal, and how those things, in your estimation, are created through the representation and the voting interests and the people who do or do not have skin in the game.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think to me, the best illustration is a school district in New York. And this was featured about a decade ago in an episode of This American Life. And I think it really hit home for a lot of people, the broader dynamic that I try to articulate in this chapter. But in East Ramapo, it's kind of an unusual district. It's I think in the suburbs of New York. And it's a very racially diverse district that has a large African-American and Latino population, but it's majority white. But it's actually Hasidic Jews who are the white population, and they mostly send their kids to private schools. And so the This American Life episode did a great job of kind of illustrating how this really affected the district. That you had really a majority voting population that had all the political power, that elected the school board, but they were not using the schools. They were using private schools. And so over time, a lot of the decisions were really about prioritizing that private school population, often at the expense of public schools. They made budget cuts. They made sure that that the yeshivas got the best buildings, and even hired some kind of shady consultants to make the case that maybe enrollment was on decline to justify selling off those buildings. And I think that story generated a lot of outrage. And at one point in the interview, the reporter for This American Life says, isn't there something wrong with the picture here where you have people who don't use the public schools really in the driver's seat making the decisions, and the school board president kind of squirmed and didn't really say one way or the other. But I think to most people, that's just fundamentally wrong. Like, why do you have a group that's not really taking advantage of public education, but controls the process, and as a result extracts all the benefits and uses it for their own goals? And the reason why I like that example is, in fact, that's actually very typical of what happens around the country. So not on the same dramatic extent, right? We don't have the same huge demographic disconnects. But in fact, almost everywhere, if you look at who elects school board members, and we can do this really easily now because we have access to voter files. So how you vote is secret, but whether you vote is actually a public record. And so there are companies out there that we were able to work with to buy data on who's actually voting in school board elections. So we know exactly who it is and who's not turning out to vote. And if you look at the population, it's especially in places where school board elections are not on cycle, not in November of even years, when turnout is incredibly low, it's overwhelmingly elderly voters without school-age children. And so we should not be surprised, right, that in the same way that in East Ramapo, the families that were using private schools had very different policy priorities than the private school students. In many other communities, that elderly voters without children don't approach education in the same way. And I think that filters down all the way down to what happens, to what school boards do, what they prioritize. And certainly, in recent years, we have had a lot of culture wars. We have a lot of arguments about bathrooms, about school mascots, about critical race theory. And we've had a lot less focus on academic achievement, even though, after the pandemic, we have seen, the NAEP scores at historic lows. And I think that's because of who votes, right? I mean, elderly people, they get really passionate about culture war stuff because they see it on Fox News. Maybe they see it on other national outlets they follow. But they don't really care all that much about test scores because it's not their kids who are impacted, and it's just not as exciting. It's not a red meat issue. And so if the voters don't have children, it changes what they care about. And ultimately, if in a democracy works through incentives, right? We want elected officials to be incentivized, to be punished and rewarded for the job that they do. And of course, it doesn't require you to be a rocket scientist to figure out if my constituents don't really care about academics, but they care a lot about these culture war issues, then you have school districts engage in these things, right? So the board members, the board meeting is all about who can use which bathroom. It's all about, who can play on which sports teams. It's all about which books are in the library. And very little about it is can our kids read? Can our kids write? Can our kids do basic math? And the San Francisco example is a great one because San Francisco, again, is one of those cities where there's very few children. And of the children that are there, San Francisco has one of the highest private school attendance rates. So most people who vote in San Francisco school board elections don't actually have children in the school system. And so San Francisco for a long time has been just incredibly dysfunctional. And you saw that during the pandemic, where instead of reopening schools, which were they were one of the last districts in California to do, they spent a lot of time taking names of former presidents off schools because they decided they were too racist, and really, illustrating kind of the disconnect between the priorities that the board thought the community cared about versus the actual academic outcomes of their students.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, a lot of them, if not all of them, were sort of recalled, right, in San Francisco.
That's right. Yeah, there was a recall election partly as a backlash to that, and there was a lot of debate about what this meant. And I think one narrative that emerged was, this is parents. This is a backlash to the parents. But when you actually look to see who voted, it was mostly adults without kids. So a lot of that backlash was also not generated by kind of people necessarily concerned about academics. I think it was more of a cultural backlash to some of the excesses, ideological excess on the school board, but not necessarily a reflection that there was tremendous parent power or a parent revolution in the way that some of the initial national journalism coverage of that recall election suggested.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting to think about the state of our schools and the way the pressures, the influences, the actors, the different pieces and parts that actually have input to that. And you make the point, and I think it's not a big surprise. Like, the people who are on local school boards are not always necessarily what you would think would be the ideal kinds of candidates. I've long said that if we really want to make positive change in our public schooling, parents need to know what school could and should be, because then they'd start demanding it from policymakers, and that leads to my assertion is that a lot of policymakers at the state level, and I would argue probably at the federal level, have a limited understanding of what school could and should be, and what good teaching looks like, and all of those kinds of things. And so it's really frustrating as someone who works in the education sort of ecosystem to continue to see this sort of furtherance of that. And I mean, I guess maybe if there's anything more to say about the sort of strangeness of how uninformed. I mean, people will always say, teachers should be paid more, should be respected more. Like, people will say that, but do they really mean that? What does that mean? What does that mean when they choose a school? What does that mean how interested they might be in figuring out, is this person a good candidate for school board, or is their decision good? Maybe is there anything meaningful and useful to say about just all of those sort of pieces in that ecosystem here?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of challenges, a lot of problems. And so, I think, and I want to back up, I think it's really important to say, and maybe this is not said enough, I do think everybody involved thinks that they have the best students' interest at heart, right? I think it'd be very hard for a school board member to wake up and look at themselves in the mirror and make bad decisions. So I think everybody has convinced themselves that they're doing the right thing. And I think the problem is, the incentives are misaligned, so that sometimes doing the wrong thing doesn't get flagged and doesn't create pressure to kind of fix it. So let me just walk through some of the things you said. I'm first of all, my book is mostly about local school board elections because that's where a lot of the decisions are made. But actually, I don't think it's just unique to local school boards. And some of the dynamics in local elections, like election timing, does make the problem worse. Off-cycle versus on-cycle election matters a lot. But I actually think it's really much more general about democracy, right? Just in numerical terms, parents are a minority. And so, democracy is designed to produce majority rule. And so in the same way that racial minorities often get ruled and get policies imposed on them that they don't like, but have not sufficient political power to stop, I think the same is true with parents and with their children. So simply getting parents, I think, more involved, it's not going to work because there's just not enough of them, right? There's very few communities where if you even got every parent mobilized, every parent to turn out, every parent paying attention to the right things, there would still be a minority of the population, a minority of the voting population, And so even if they voted as a bloc, it's unlikely that they by themselves could actually bring about significant change. So I think that's one of the challenges. It's just a pure numbers game that, democracy is about majorities, and parents are not the majority of the voting population. So the second point, I think, is also really important. And I would put it under the bucket of information. I think it's really hard as a parent and also as a non-parent who's voting in these elections, just to know, right? I mean, is education, is our school doing a good job or not? It's often, parents love their teachers because they're really mostly evaluating their bedside manner. And I want to give a medical analogy here. So Marty Makary, who is the current FDA commissioner, he had a book that came out, I think about 10 years ago, called Unaccountable. And it begins with a chapter that I always remember about his time in medical school. And there were two doctors. He was a resident. There was two doctors that they were working with. One was nicknamed Dr. Hodad, which stood for Hands of Death and Destruction. And the other one was called the Jackal because he had such terrible bedside manner. Wow. And the entire story was really about Dr. Hodad being just a terrible doctor, but was beloved because he had this amazing presentation, had this amazing bedside manner. And so even famous actors sought him out to be their surgeon because they didn't know better, because they were judging him based on his appearance and how he acted. Whereas the Jackal was a terrible doctor. Was a fantastic doctor, but patients hated him because, again, all they saw was the bedside manner. And I think that's a big issue in education, right? It's really hard to measure quality. It's very hard to assess quality. And so most parents, when they're thinking about, is my kid getting a good education, they're looking at the report card. And if the kid's getting A's, that means that they're learning everything. And then they go into parent-teacher conferences, and the teacher is nice and friendly, and the kid's having a good time. And to them, the bedside manner is great. So unless there's a way to provide really objective, high-quality information to parents that makes them aware of the quality of the education, and also to the broader community who's voting, I think it's actually really, really hard. Because, again, most of the signals we get are really much more about the bedside manner dimension of it, rather than the underlying quality and performance that we ultimately, at the end of the day, care about.
Yeah. Well, one of the things so I agree with you. Most people would think that they have the best interest of students at heart, and they're not acting nefariously, and I think that's generally right. But in chapter 3, you start getting into the politics and partisanship and sort of tribalism. And it reminded me, when you said that, it reminded me of a neighbor who, when I first moved into my neighborhood, you're a teacher. She said something like, I'll probably get it not exactly right, but she said, why do so many teachers hate students? And I was like, what are you talking about? But very, somebody who's very activated by like Fox News and sort of the MAGA kind of complaints and grievances that, you are obviously aware of, I'm obviously aware of. And, I think you make a really important point in that those kinds of battles and things that we're seeing, the pressures being put on schools and those kinds of issues are actually hurting the learning of students. And to the extent you want to talk about that, I'd be happy to hear that. But one of the things that in that chapter that I highlighted and thought, this is an interesting assertion. You suggest that partisan polarization is a top-down, elite-driven process. So can you kind of unpack that and what that means for the issues that we're talking about here?
Yeah. So I'll start with a concrete example that I think for me first illustrated this. You may remember during the pandemic, there was a lot of controversy about when to resume in-person learning. Mm-hmm. And we had also tremendous variation. So there was many states, particularly in the South, particularly conservative states, that reopened full-time in fall of 2020. And then there's other districts, mostly urban districts, mostly in blue states, that stayed closed, in some cases in California for like a year. And the big puzzle is why was it the case? Why was it that districts, presumably responding to the same public health information, were interpreting it differently? And second, why was it so partisan? And there was several studies done in summer of 2020 that showed that it was actually partisanship of the community more than COVID case rates that predicted whether school districts reopened. And so, I went back and I tried to figure out what was the moment that school reopening, which on its face should not be a partisan issue, became partisan. And we actually, in the spring of 2020, had really good polling data from around the country. And I actually could find an exact 2-week period where public opinion on school reopening went from being not at all partisan, not at all divided, to really highly partisan amongst partisan lines. And it was, I think, in May of 2020. And we knew exactly what happened. There was an incident involving Anthony Fauci testifying in Congress that then resulted in President Trump at a press conference being asked for his opinion on schools. And President Trump came out and said, schools must reopen. And as soon as he said that, it became a red-blue issue. And what was interesting was public opinion followed, right? As soon as you got the message that being pro-school reopening was being pro-Trump, then the people who were pro-Trump became pro-school reopening, and the people who were anti-Trump became anti-school reopening. So it became kind of like a proxy. But the fact that it took President Trump saying that, I think, is a powerful illustration. So something similar happened a decade earlier with the Common Core standards. So there was an effort, first really a bipartisan effort. There was a lot of Republicans involved. It was mostly non-governmental, to really get not just more standardized curriculum across the country, but also raise the bar. So one of the things we saw, under No Child Left Behind and the Bush era reforms was there was tremendous incentive to really reduce standards to make it easier to pass tests. And so Common Core was in some ways a response to that. And initially it was incredibly popular. And it wasn't until President Obama really became a champion of Common Core and became branded as Obama Core that you also saw mass polarization. And what was interesting about that issue was a group at Harvard that does a lot of public opinion polling actually had 2 versions of the same question. So what version 1 asked people, are you in favor of Common Core? And version 2 just said, are you in favor of just national education standards, without mentioning that particular brand? And when you mentioned Common Core, there was a huge partisan divide, where Democrats were much more in favor, Republicans were much more against. When you didn't mention Common Core, when you just said in the abstract, should we have a set of national standards? There was almost no partisan divide. So I think it was another case where voters were seeing, okay, the president is for it, therefore how I feel about the president is a proxy for where I should be on this issue. And I think that is especially true, again, amongst voters who don't have kids, right? For them, it's not like these issues really matter directly. It's not like it affects the quality of the education their kids get. It's really a symbolic issue, a performative issue, and it's a way to signal, are you on team red or are you on team blue? And so I think that is definitely a big part of the story of why mass attitudes amongst the regular voters really on these issues that on their face don't seem like they should be partisan become so partisan.
Yeah, well, and you talk about reading, and the teaching of reading is sort of the reading wars, and to your point, that was polarized, and I think you tie that to George W. Bush, and correct me if I'm wrong there, and it's just fascinating, and so it's angering because all of these things seem to be just constantly filtered through a tribal partisan lens. I don't know. It feels like more increasingly so. I don't know if you feel that way too, but it's easy to come to that conclusion when you're living in the moment. But there for a few weeks as COVID quote unquote hit, like early March, it wasn't a coded red or blue yet, like masks or any of that was not coded. And we were all just trying to figure it out. And then some of those things that you mentioned happened, and probably some other things. And people were like, oh, that's my team. That's what I have to choose. And they've done that a little bit with reading and phonics and, the reading wars. But what I've seen there, and I had Emily Hanford on as part of a panel discussion, and I've kind of dived into that a little bit myself. And what I found with her reporting, because she works for American Public Media, which is associated with NPR, which is certainly not coded red by any stretch of the imagination, and it's somewhat morphed. I don't know if you would agree with that, but it's one of the few issues now, I think, that is mixed in who is in favor of it and who it is not. It doesn't seem to be very closely aligned with partisan tribalism. Would you agree?
Yeah. I think that's a great example that in some ways maybe it's the exception that proves the rule. And you're right that historically how we teach reading was coded in a very partisan way. And it was also, incredibly polarized. And there's a great anecdote from the book that I stumbled upon. So Nicholas Lehman, who's now a reporter for The New Yorker, In the 1990s, he used to write for the Atlantic Monthly. And in the mid 1990s, California was kind of going through a big debate about how to teach reading. They were one of the early adopters of whole language, and their test scores cratered. And so there was a big push to bring in phonics. And so in 1997, Nicholas Lehman went to California, and he wrote an article for the Atlantic about the California reading wars. And if you were to read the article today, and I think many of your listeners can just Google, Lehman reading wars, it's just incredible. Like, he says, I've talked to people in California, and I'm just shocked by how divisive this is. They say this is one of the most crazy political conflicts ever. There's a quote from, I think, a state legislator who says, this issue is so polarized, it's worse than abortion, right? So imagine teaching reading to be on the level of abortion. And it was very much coded as a left-right issue. So there's a curriculum scholar who in the late 1990s argued that phonics was really a code word for like fundamentalist Christians trying to take over the schools. So there was very much like this view that that there was a red and blue way of teaching reading. And if you fast forward to the early 2020s, that has gone completely away. Not only in terms of mass opinion, but we've had in the last few years about half of all U.S. states pass science and reading laws. And if you look to see how the votes broke down on the floor of state legislatures, almost no partisan divide. And so the question is, what happened? How did we take an issue that really was incredibly polarized and make it less so? And I think Emily Hanford's reporting was really pivotal to that, right? And I think it illustrates, the other side to the top-down dynamics. Yes, it is President Trump and President Obama polarizing voters, but a lot of this is mediated by the media, right? I mean, very few people actually watch press conferences of the president. They mostly, log into X, or they log into TikTok, or they watch Fox News, they watch MSNBC. And so how the media either amplifies these divisions, or in the case of science reading, de-amplifies the divisions, I think has a huge role to play. And the fact that Emily Hanford was able to take an issue that literally for decades was so partisan, and really in a matter of just 2 years, take all the partisanship out of it and build a bipartisan consensus on an issue that before did not have a consensus, really illustrates, again, the extent to which kind of attitudes are malleable. They are responsive to these top-down elite influences, but also the extent to which the media play a huge role, right? And so we really need much more Emily Hanfords, I think, in education, in covering these issues in a way that maybe reduces some of the volume, reduces some of the partisanship, and really focuses more on the academics. And I think that is something that Sold a Story did really well, right? It said, listen, America's kids can't read as well as we might hope, and how they're being taught is a huge part of the story. And so I think if we can have more of that kind of thinking, more of that kind of approach to education issues, rather than, I think, the way education journalism usually works, which is in some ways, I think, amplifying some of these divisions.
Yeah. Well, the sort of science of reading is, I think, a subset of the sort of pedagogy wars, science of learning kinds of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I've been involved in a lot of those conversations, and I've seen some hints and things from Emily Hanford's work that leads me to believe that she might be thinking about that larger kind of issues, and I'll be really curious to see if that happens, and I may be totally wrong on that. Because that to me right now is also a little bit less. I mean, it's not particularly partisan. It's a little bit with like classical education. And that's certainly coded red. But as an inquiry advocate, I don't think that that's necessarily coded red or blue or anything like that. So we'll see. Hopefully, because we certainly need some progress in that area as well. But back to the partisanship, one of the examples that you use is this Democrat. His last name is Mock, and he was. You would talk about his voting on a CRT, critical race theory bill. And that's such an interesting issue, because I push back on, lots of folks who say critical race theory has infected all of our schools. And I say, well, come to Western Kentucky and let's see what that looks like. Certainly in certain places and geographies and demographics. And I have some real problems with critical race theory, but that's a whole other issue. But the way in which he voted on the critical race theory bill, but then voted much different on the science of reading bill, and how those two things were, I guess I would say, incoherent logically and ideologically. So maybe you can kind of unpack that example.
Yeah, and I think the reason why I talk about those issues kind of together is, to me, it was a perfect natural experiment because both of these topics were happening and playing out at the same time. So you had state legislatures voting, in 2021, 2022, on whether to ban critical race theory and other, I guess, that became known as divisive concepts before it all morphed into DEI. And at the same time, it really, in many cases in the same legislatures, you had states enacting science of reading laws. And so, I try to find states that had done both. And so one of the states that had really in the same legislative session had passed, on one hand, a CRT ban, and on the other hand, a science of reading mandate. And so, one of the legislators I was able to talk to was Representative Corey Mock from North Dakota. And North Dakota is one of these states. And he was a Democrat. He had a pretty long-standing interest in education. He was also previously, I think, one of the Democratic leaders. And he had voted yes on the science of reading, and he had voted no on CRT, which was, again, very similar to the dynamic we saw across the country. And my question to him was, well, what's the difference? Like, isn't this essentially the same thing? This is state legislators stepping in, imposing top-down curricular mandates, telling teachers how to teach. And why is it okay to do that with reading, but not okay to do that with social studies and history and CRT? Again, 1619 Project was big in the news at the time. And it was interesting because I think very few of these legislators had thought about these issues through that lens, right? That they were really variants of the same underlying question of when is it appropriate for state legislators who are not educators to step in and change state law. And so it was very illuminating because I think you got to see how much of it was driven by kind of their perception of public opinion, how much their constituents were upset. And, with critical race theory, there was a lot of mobilization on both sides. You had the conservative activists who were saying, kids are being ideologically brainwashed. But you had other people mobilizing saying they're just trying to take honest history out. They don't want to teach about slavery. Whereas the science of reading, there's very little opposition. I think everybody generally thought that kids should be able to read. And so when these bills came up for a vote, first of all, it was generally coming from education professionals. So in the case of North Dakota, it was the state superintendent who was Republican, but very widely respected across both parties. And there was no town halls. There was no angry people showing up with signs saying, you can't teach phonics. And that really changed how the legislators approach these issues. And for them, voting yes on one curricular mandate and no on the other was not at all, inconsistent.
Yeah. So moving forward here, and I guess one of the questions that is related to a lot of this, and perhaps more to the school choice, which is a little bit later discussed in the book. One of the things that I see a lot of with people who are sort of activists, whether it's school choice or critical race theory or whatever, is that there are nefarious actors who are sort of conspiratorial, right? Like Betsy DeVos is the villain, a villain in the school choice, and I don't know, I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, it certainly wouldn't surprise me if there are some plans to change our public schools into something that's more consistent with her ideology and things like that. But I wonder how you see that, or what kind of the evidence that you've seen as in your work are there sort of, I guess, the motives behind a lot of these activists, are they narrow enough just to like critical race theory or whatever their sort of pet project is, or do you think there is some truth to that sort of grand plan that some of the folks will attribute to these villains?
I think it's always hard to know what is in someone's heart, right? So I generally prefer to assume that everybody has good intentions. And I think,
do I.
Yeah, and I think one of the arguments I make is, it turns out the road to hell is actually paved with good intentions. So a lot of the problems we see is not, again, terrible people with evil mustache twirling plans, but it's people that are trying to do their best, but really don't think through the A, unintended consequences, but also B, don't necessarily recognize that things that they think are obvious and the right thing could be contested. And so I think it's much more of that. So, and maybe I can give you kind of two examples that are not in the book, but to me really illustrate this. We had last summer, we had a Supreme Court case out of Montgomery County in Maryland dealing with parent opt-outs for LGBT themed books. The court said essentially that the Montgomery County policy of not letting parents opt out was unconstitutional. And that was a very divisive issue. And for many people, they said, well, like, we have a diverse community. What's wrong with exposing kids to books that just happen to have, two men getting married? It's not like we're promoting same-sex marriage. We're not even saying it's good or not. We're just reflecting the community. And then, if you go to Tennessee had a state law passed. It's called the Meet Baby Olivia Act that required health classes to basically show a video about fetal development that was pretty clearly designed to have a pro-life message. Starting with the claim that that life begins at conception, and for many people that who were objecting to what Montgomery County was doing, saying this is brainwashing, this is ideological propaganda, they were on the other side in Tennessee, and they're saying, no, we're just sharing the facts. This is just how biology works. This is at 7 weeks, this is what a fetus can and can't do. And many of the people who in Montgomery County were on the side of having LGBT themed books in Tennessee were saying, how dare you try to use a curriculum to brainwash our kids? And so I think it just goes to show you that again, I think it really depends on kind of your ideological perspective, and things that in your mind seem totally fine and not at all objectionable, to people who disagree with you, come across as being this crazy plan to hijack the schools and turn kids against the parents' values. And I think it's a very difficult challenge, right? Because the connection between parents and their kids is really important. And so when people think that that the schools are being hijacked to push agendas that they don't agree with, it's easy to take it really personally. It's really easy to get really riled up about it, and it's really easy then to kind of formulate not as a conspiracy theories, but really kind of demonize the other side and really think that what they're doing is just outrageous. When again, I think in both cases, people had what they thought was just reasonable intentions, but again, it came across in a very very polarizing way. And I think it's just really hard to avoid with education, given how personal that is, right? I mean, just the bond between parents and kids is always going to be personal, and that's where education works. It's at that intersection. So I think in general, we would all be better off. Really, I think just giving people we disagree with the benefit of the doubt. And I think in some ways, maybe if we were a little bit more, if we were, to the extent that we want to become conspirational or kind of call people out, maybe if we start with people we agree with and say, in general, I agree, but I think maybe this is going too far. I think that's probably lead to much better engagement than when we, for the most part, focus on finding fault with what people we disagree with do, and then also trying to rationalize and defend things that people we agree with do. I think that's a pretty bad combination. I think it leads to a lot of the social ills that we see today, not just in education, but in politics more generally.
Yeah, I mean, that tribalism, that polarization that we can see so obviously at play, and how sort of corrosive and destructive that is, and producing some really bad results in education and beyond. I can imagine Emily Hanford and those folks just hoping that somebody like Donald Trump wouldn't endorse the science of reading.
Yeah.
Because it would just perhaps totally derail things. I do a lot of project-based learning work, and I heard him say once, not too long ago, something about praising and instituting project-based learning, and I thought, oh yay, oh wait, that might be bad.
Yeah, exactly.
That may not work out. But that gets to a larger question for me, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts about this. Is that it's my assertion is that most people in the United States, if given the opportunity to see examples of what I would say are Enlightenment liberal principles, the things that uphold our democracy, that they're in favor of them, even though they. And I think this is a problem of K-12 education that we have done for decades now, a really poor job of educating people about what those are and giving them opportunities to sort of practice, put those things into practice. And that some of the evidence of that is if you use the word Enlightenment liberal, that turns off, something like 50% of the certainly most of the Fox viewers. But that authoritarian liberalism that we see on the left and right, how do we, if you have an idea, like how do we help teachers in schools, or how important might that be to help them understand those principles? And I mean, we do work with schools. It doesn't raise test scores, so it doesn't get as much traction as I wish it did. But it seems to me like that is something so important in helping us move beyond some of these politics, because as soon as there's something coded and it's associated with a tribe, it's like almost impossible to have any meaningful conversation or progress on it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And actually, we're not the first people to kind of make that argument. I went back recently and I reread Horace Mann, who's it's seen by many as the founder of modern public education. He was I think, secretary of the board in Massachusetts, and he was all about common schools. For him, common schools was the idea that we would have one school system for everybody, regardless of class, regardless of their of their religion, and the schools would be a way to bring people together and kind of get everybody on board with a common set of values. So he has kind of interesting reputation. A lot of people like him, a lot of people don't like him. But if you go back and you read I think it's his 12th annual speech when he's talking about political education, where he's talking about forming citizens, he actually then after laying out how this could work well, he has a warning. He said, the one thing we don't want though is we don't want, and actually uses the word indoctrination. He said we don't want teachers coming to the classroom and teaching like contested and controversial political ideas, because then everybody will want their own schools. Democrats will want the Democratic schools, Republicans will want the Republican schools, and the entire public education system will collapse because it will be about tribalism. So it was interesting that even though he believed in the idea of, again, kind of socialization through education, he was also very, very, very mindful of the fact that you have to tread very carefully and you have to really avoid kind of the landmines. And I think your intuition about public opinion is exactly right. So Morgan Polikoff, who was a professor at University of Southern California, they've been doing a lot of polling over the years on public opinion on education. And when you ask people about how should schools teach all sorts of subjects, including really controversial contested subjects like LGBT related subjects, including history and racism, it turns out there's like not much disagreement. There's really a large bipartisan consensus. For example, like most parents think, in high school, LGBT stuff is fine. Maybe elementary school is a little too young. And most parents, red or blue, say, yeah, we should teach about slavery and we should teach about the harms. So it's definitely the case that the activist class and the people who are most visible and who maybe drive some of the debates are not representative. So the question is that kind of, how do we minimize their influence? And I think the other part of the story, and I'm curious what you think, this is, I think, maybe closer to your work, but working on this book project, I came away pretty depressed about the state of teacher preparation and teacher education in this country. And I have the impression, and maybe the science of reading is one indication of that like, I do worry that too many school and teacher preparation programs see themselves as really kind of being part of kind of a social justice program, that that teachers need to be trained, right, to focus on oppression, to promote ideas associated generally with the political left, and often at the expense of like basic curriculum about how to teach, right? So teachers don't get a lot of training about like what is the research on the psychology of learning show. They get a lot of research on reading Ibram X. Kendi, and to me that is a warning sign, right? I mean, if the colleges of education have kind of picked a side in these culture wars, and then we get into the world that Horace Mann warned us about, which is where people begin to view schools not just as a neutral ground to get a common set of values and beliefs, but really as something to fight over, because if you're in the majority, you can impose your views on others. And I worry that we've done that a little bit with how College of Education, how ideologically insular they are and ideologically homogenous. I don't know what you think. You probably work much more in that space.
Well, I think that's a really important question, and something that I have spent some time and had some conversations about. And similar to what I said earlier with critical race theory, like I definitely can give you examples and have cited examples, and in some of the work that we do with schools on the what we call objective pluralism and enlightenment, intellectual and civic principles and things like that. We do talk about some of that, but the idea that it's happening in all of our schools, I think, is not true. But I think there's filters, like, so you might have somebody, I'm sure you heard, like, well, we don't teach critical race theory in schools. Well, okay, you might see one or two examples of that. Demographically, geographically, I think you're much more likely to see it like a San Francisco, Seattle, or Washington, D.C., or something like that, but not in Bowling Green, Kentucky. So that doesn't mean that you won't see some evidence of something like critical race theory. And so the derivative of that, right? So people who might be activists, and then they hear from activists, and so it sort of trickles down until you have some very watered down versions of that, maybe at a Western Kentucky university, where you're not going to see the same kind of activist kind of mindset that you would see at Columbia Teachers College, right? But you will still see some of that, and sort of maybe at least some nod and wink to that mindset of, I wonder if this is racist. Should be saying that? I'm not really sure, right?
Yeah.
And so that's not really critical race theory, but it's sort of a derivative of that. And so it's sort of poison is determined by the dose. And Columbia Teachers College, I think you're very likely to see that, and I think that can be a real problem. And you're maybe more likely to see something that's more Christian oriented, although you're not going to see much of that in education schools. The Howard Zinn history, I think, is definitely something that we should take a look at, and I think is definitely looks at the U.S. history through a lens that probably is not as charitable to the founding ideals and the principles and Enlightenment civic and intellectual virtues that I think are really important. I think that's part of why we've not taught generations to understand some of the things of free speech and why we're in the mess that we're in now. And we see it right and left, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned Ibram X. Kendi, and as part of some of that work that I mentioned, I would show you probably have seen it, this sort of suggested amendment, but by Ibram X. Kendi, of having an anti-racist agency that's unelected and so on and so forth. And so what I did was created a version that was similar, but it's about anti-American, as though it was from Donald Trump. And basically parallel language. And I did this quite a few years ago, and it feels like we're getting very close to that sort of amendment idea from Donald Trump, or executive order or something like that. But when you show that to the people who tend to be a little bit more left, they go, oh, that's terrible, and they can see why.
Yeah.
And then you show them the Ibram X. Kendi version, and of course they're like, oh. And I've done it both directions. And so that's why I say, if you give them examples, I just don't think that most of the people, whether they're in education pre-service programs or just general citizenry, they don't think about these things. They haven't been really well educated in these principles. And so while it makes some sense if you point it out to them, they're not able to articulate it. And they may not even, they don't want to be a racist, so they go, okay, I'll go with, or they don't want to be they want to be a patriot, so they'll go with what, right? So I think it depends. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I guess there's two things I think I worry about. One is, I think the social context in college of education, I worry that it selects for a particular kind of person who finds, social justice appealing. And it has kind of a compositional impact on who goes into teaching in a way that I think in the long run might reduce trust and might exacerbate some of these culture war issues. I think the second point, which is related, I think it's one thing to get people to agree that we want to teach, Enlightenment values. And I suspect you would get some pushback in places like Columbia.
Yep.
But I guess the other part is we actually have to teach educators about the methods, right? We know what the goal is, but we actually need evidence, right? We need careful research. We need hopefully randomized controlled trials or quasi-experimental research to show, like, if our goal is to inculcate these values, what methods work and what doesn't work. And my concern is, like, I think too little teacher preparation actually focuses on that kind of evidence. It focuses on the actual mechanisms of instruction, and so much more of it focuses on big picture theories. And I think that's how we get into, like, the science of reading issues, that it goes back to, like, a disconnect between the kinds of applied insights that teachers actually need to teach reading versus the kind of big picture theories that teacher preparation programs tend to focus on. And I think that's probably true in the context of citizenship education and the kinds of things that you're interested in.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I've been pretty critical, and I think that most people in education don't tend to have a very positive view of their pre-service program, and I think some of what you're talking about is definitely true. And before I forget, one thing that I think is an interesting, I guess, data point or some evidence is, yes, I think there's a selection of people who go into education who tend to be a little bit more left-leaning or become a little bit more left-leaning as part of that, and maybe both are true. But I don't know if you've seen it, and it was quite a few years ago now, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years ago maybe, but Heritage, who of course is certainly not left by any stretch of the imagination, did a survey or some sort of research, and they found that while most of that population and teachers and education are certainly left-leaning, they aren't particularly ideological or trying to be activists and things like that. Again, I think you'll find it in some spaces, and I can certainly point you to some examples of that. But your point, I think, is well taken in terms of what are how well are our teachers being prepared, and one of the issues there is, are they being taught how to teach and using the research and those kinds of things. But a tangential issue and germane to the conversation we're having, I think, is the time that they might be taking to learn how to be better teachers being taken by conversations and classwork that is political in nature or activist in nature, which is the same kind of problem, I think, that you point to about how the politics and the grievance and the culture war stuff is subsuming at some education, superintendents and things like that, and making it harder for them to do not the teacher preparation, but actually do the things that help their schools better serve their students. So I know there's an example that you give in the book, I think, about a superintendent. Maybe you can remember that and want to share that or talk to that.
Yeah. Well, I think I give 2 examples in that chapter. So the chapter is called Adult Culture Wars and Student Achievement, and it uses some data from the Cato Institute. They have a really amazing data set where really anytime there's an education controversy that gets news attention, they map it. And so they have this amazing data set going back almost 20 years now. And so there's 2, I think, illustrative examples that have kind of different ideological valence. One was a school district in rural Southern California, in a very rural area, where their mascot for 100 years was the Arab, and it was a very, very offensive mascot. Had a hooked nose, had every stereotype of a Middle Eastern person, and there was an interesting backstory. It wasn't meant to be offensive. They had imported some crops from the Middle East that were central to the agricultural economy, and so they wanted to kind of celebrate that. So about 15 years ago, this got the attention of a major Arab American civil rights organization, and they reached out and said, this is outrageous, you need to change your mascot right now. And the superintendent, who was an African American superintendent from the Deep South, reporting to a majority minority school board in a district that's majority Latino, to them, this was like the first time it even occurred to them that the mascot could be controversial. And many of the alumni of the high school said, we love our mascot. There's no way you're changing it. And so it took 8 months of essentially really like, back and forth diplomacy, negotiating a compromise to get a new mascot that on one hand the alumni could still accept, and on the other hand was not offensive to the Arab American community. And the question I think I ask is, imagine all the other things that the superintendent could have spent that 8 months doing. And so the other example is a district, also a rural district in Pennsylvania, that about 20 years ago decided to require the teaching of intelligent design in their high school biology class. And so this immediately got controversial. They got sued. There was a lot of crazy drama. There's a lot of misremembering about what happened and for what reasons. The superintendent had to testify, and in the view of many, maybe kind of light on the stand, maybe try to shield the school board from some of their bad decisions. So this became such a huge scandal. They lost the case. First of all, they were forced to pay the other party's attorney's fees, which was $1 million, and this was a district with about a $30 million budget, so it's a pretty big chunk of change. But it was also so disruptive to the community, because in the next election you had a pro-evolution candidate slate, run. They won the election. The first thing they did is they fired the superintendent because they thought the superintendent had been enabling the previous intelligent design majority. They I think fired some of the other administrators, and the entire community was just divided. Right? It was really almost like a civil war. And there was the financial costs. There was the disruptive cost of getting rid of your superintendent, bringing in new administrators, and those administrators bringing in new policy priorities. All of those are, I think, the costs that we often don't think about, that are maybe less salient, but those are the costs of fighting these culture war battles in the schools. They really, again, take time and resources away from what could be happening in the classroom and what could be focused on students.
Yeah, and some of them are not necessarily even, I guess, true or accurate. I mean, I did a podcast with a woman, Courtney Gore, who lives in Texas, was on the school board, was actually I think sort of chosen by Moms for Liberty, and she went to investigate, some of these claims of, I don't know what it was, books that were inappropriate or whatever, and she found no evidence, and said there's no smoke or there's no fire here, and then she became part of a whole storm, and the time we're wasting on some of these things, not that they're not necessarily not important, but to your point, like what's the opportunity cost there, right?
Yep.
Well, I'm mindful of time, and I want to wrap us up, but one of the things that I alluded to beginning of our conversation was the end here of some of the suggestions you have for education reform. There's several. I won't get into all of them. People should buy the book, read the book. But the one that I thought was perhaps most interesting for our conversation is, I guess one way to characterize it, maybe not as gratuitously as I should, is that basically you're in favor of less democracy. So explain that.
Yeah. I know that's going to come off kind of controversial, but the point I make is there are many other policy areas where we actually realize that democratic incentives may create problems. There is a reason why we have judges with lifetime appointments, because we think sometimes if you're a judge and you have to get reelected, you might not make the most just decisions. You might be worried about the next election. There's a reason why, and this is something that certainly should be very, very timely. There's a reason why we have a Federal Reserve with an independent board, because we know elected officials, may not necessarily think about the long-term impact of on inflation, of short-term fiscal policy that helps them get reelected. So, in the context of criminal justice, in the context of monetary policy, I think increasingly in the context of housing policy, there's really consensus that democratic accountability can actually lead to bad policy, right? It leads to a criminal justice system that's too punitive. It leads to monetary policy that's too inflationary. It leads to housing policy that creates a lack of affordable housing. And I think the same thing is true in education, right? Too much democratic accountability, because it's accountability to voters who don't really have kids and don't really care about education, also leads to the same, I think, negative consequences. So, and as a general principle, I think in the same way that we decided sometimes it might be good to provide a little insulation. It might be good to maybe temper down some of the electoral pressures, because that might actually lead to better policy. I think the same is true in K-12 education. And so we shouldn't just out of hand say, oh, this is not democratic and therefore it's bad. And I think we have done that. And I'll give you just two examples. after Katrina hit New Orleans, there was a lot of reforms, and there was a great podcast that came out recently that really illustrates this. But one of the things we know that before Katrina, New Orleans schools were just abominable. I mean, the level of corruption was insane to the point that the FBI had a field office inside the district because there's so much corruption. They actually had to set up an office in the district to like get everybody. Academic achievement was abysmal. One of the valedictorians at one of the high schools couldn't actually graduate because she couldn't pass the high school exit exam. So I think it was consensus amongst everybody that the quality of education in New Orleans was terrible. Katrina hit. That set in motion a variety of reforms I will get into, but essentially all the teachers were fired, the school board was scrapped, and New Orleans became 100% charter schools with no democracy. Now there's still competition. There's still, you have to attract kids and parents, and if your school wasn't very good, they would go elsewhere. And one of the things we know from research by Doug Harris at Tulane was that in the following decade after Katrina, academic performance in New Orleans increased dramatically. Really dramatically. It's very hard to find, I think, other educational interventions that have produced gains of that magnitude at almost no increase in cost, right? So I think that's one example where, and today, I think the memory of Katrina is very divided. So people that care about education say, this is what's possible. We took a dysfunctional, low-performing district, and we turned it around, and we created opportunity for children. And as many other people say, well, forget all of that. Where's the democracy? We lost the democracy, and that should be, the way we judge it. I think the other example, which is going on now, is in Houston, Texas, where Houston had a few really low-performing schools. Houston has a mandatory state takeover law, so that if you don't turn around those schools, the state comes in and effectively fires your school board, and the state commissioner appoints a superintendent. So that happened in Houston. They got a new superintendent. They got a guy named Mike Miles, who came in, brought in a series of reforms. Again, tremendous community opposition because Houston is a majority minority community. It's a pretty blue community. And so now you have, a bunch of white guys from state government who are Republicans coming in and taking political power from this minority community. And yet, over the past 2 years, the academic gains in Houston under this receivership have been tremendous. Again, it's hard to think of other large urban districts that have recorded such academic gains in such a short period of time. I think that's another example where, people are pointing to democracy and using democracy as a cudgel and really saying, forget about the quality, forget about how it's impacted kids, forget about the fact that kids are learning more, can go to college now, and might have a better life. The real metric is, are voters getting a say? And I just think that's the wrong way to think about education. And in the case of Katrina and Houston, it does show that sometimes giving up a little bit democratic control could bring about really tremendous improvements in the quality of education.
So you're not making the assertion that where that control should be a little bit more. So it's still local, I would assume, or.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I'm open to possibilities and alternatives that we haven't even thought of. I think my point is just narrower, that if those alternatives and opportunities may mean a little bit less direct control, if it may mean having something like a Federal Reserve Board for schools in the community, which is not elected, we shouldn't dismiss out of hand that could be a better model of governing the district, that might be a way to actually produce better education in a way that I think now our knee-jerk reactions to say, if it's less democracy, it must be bad. And I think that those two just don't follow from one another.
Well, there's a tension there, and we don't have time to get into it, but I can hear Neil McCluskey from Cato turning over in his grave when you say, not in his grave, he's still alive, turning over about, sort of Federal Reserve. But it does strike me, and I've said this, and I thought, Betsy DeVos missed an opportunity to actually do some real leadership from the federal level of clarifying what our priorities are, what we should be doing, really working with states and local, giving them some directive or direction. But therein lies, certainly for a libertarian, a little more than a little bit of tension. Well, like I said, I'm mindful of time here. The book is No Adult Left Behind: How Politics Hijacks Education Policy and Hurts Kids. We'll put links to buy it in the show notes. Lots of stuff we didn't cover, talking about jobs and housing and NIMBY and all kinds of things. So anything that you want to share before we sign off, links, information, anything like that?
Yeah. So if anybody wants to order the book, I have a link set up. It's www.noadultleftbehind.org/order, and that actually takes you right to the Cambridge University Press website. And if people order through Cambridge and they use Kogan25 at checkout, so my last name Kogan 25, they get 20% off. So I just want to make sure that people are aware of that.
Great. I know you're on the Twitter X. You want to mention that or anything else?
Yeah, people can find me on X, and my my handle. I actually have to look it up.
Well, I'll look it up and put it in the show notes. Yep. Okay. Well, like I said, it's a lot of information and enjoyable read, especially for somebody who's interested in this stuff. Certainly did your homework. I would definitely recommend folks pick it up if they are interested in politics and education, because it's a good read. So thanks for the conversation.
Thanks for having me on.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.